Well, greetings everyone. Welcome back. I am no longer broadcasting from my cave. I have moved to a new location. But this is a real background behind me. One of these days, maybe I'll hang a flag or something back there. But anyway, we're out of the closet and somewhere else doing this in my new setup. So, we are now going to move on to the second half of this class, and we pick up in World War II. We kind of introduced it last time. You will watch a documentary called World War II, among others, and it will fill in other details maybe that I don't get to. So I titled this lecture Awakening a Sleeping Giant. These are the words of one of the Japanese leaders when they realized what they had done. And so this gets us into World War II, the United States entry into World War II. And so officially the war goes from 1939 to 1945. However, the U.S. isn't officially involved until 1941 after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And we'll talk more about the bombing here in just a minute. And of course, you'll see some about it in in one of your videos. So December 7, 1941, which President Roosevelt said was a date which will live in infamy, one of his most famous speeches, one of the most famous speeches in American history. The reality, though, is we were probably going to enter the war by the following summer anyway. We were preparing for it as we were trying to remain neutral. We were preparing for the war. We were drafting, as we'll see, and our allies were losing. And so kind of like in World War I, it was getting to a point where we were going to have to intervene anyway for our own sake. The fear was, just like in the First World War, especially Britain, if they go down, if they're in trouble, then we're in trouble. So we're going to join anyway as the consensus. But Japan bombing Pearl Harbor made the decision a little bit sooner and probably a little bit easier. But leading up to that, we've talked in previous lectures how the Japanese were invading China and around the Pacific, and how the Germans were scooping up different pieces of Europe, and Italy was invading Africa and Albania and places like that. And again, everyone was just kind of turning a blind eye or saying, oh, it's not that big of a deal, until it became a big deal finally when Poland was invaded by the Germans and the Russians. So that's when the British and the French officially entered into what we call World War II. So there's your 1939 date. However, the United States had already declared itself neutral prior to the war actually beginning. We saw it coming. We knew it was going to happen, and we wanted to stay out of it. Again, we've been involved in several wars like this, and we don't want to be in one. We're still in that mode after World War I where we do not want to go to war, whatever the cost. Also, we're broke, and you gotta remember that. Even though things are going to get a little better at the tail end of the 1930s, primarily because of the war, we're broke. And in 1937, we're dead broke. The New Deal has helped a little, but not that much. All right. So basically, the United States declared itself neutral, and part of the Neutrality Act said we are going to sell stuff to everyone, but we're not going to sell war material. Right. Well, by 1939, that's going to change. And a new kind of mode of thinking is going to come into being called cash and carry. And that says, okay, we're still neutral, but we realize that our friends, the British and the French mainly, need help. And so we are going to start selling them war material. And that's actually going to start helping our economy tremendously. And then we're going to institute the draft. We're going to get ready for this war. Remember, in World War I, we really weren't ready. We didn't really have enough soldiers trained, and it took us a while to get to that point. So we're going to institute the draft in 1940. It'll go to about 1946, kind of slack off for a couple years, and then we'll reinstitute it in 1948, and we'll draft all the way through Vietnam. The draft in this war, though, was a little different. I mean, everyone thinks of the draft in terms of Vietnam. Nobody really wanted to go to Vietnam. And so your number came up, and you kind of hoped that your number wouldn't, and that you wouldn't have to go. In 1940s World War II America, the draft almost reduced the number of people that were coming into the Army or the Navy or the Marine Corps every year, because they could only train so many at a time. So many people were volunteering that the draft numbers actually helped separate that out. Unlike, again, Vietnam, where very few people were volunteering. Well, we're then going to switch to something called the Lend-Lease program in 1941. Cash and carry wasn't working. And part of that was the Allies could buy whatever they wanted from us, but they had to carry it themselves and they had to pay for it right then. We weren't going to do credit. Remember, we loaned them billions of dollars in World War I that they still haven't paid back. And that led in part to the Great Depression. So we're not doing that again. But on the other hand, by 1941, they're doing so bad, and now Russia is an ally. We'll talk more about that later. They're doing so bad. They need our help bad. So Lend-Lease is the new program. And basically Roosevelt and Congress have power to kind of lend, lease, give, sell, do whatever they want to whoever they want in order to protect the United States. We're still officially uninvolved in the war, but we're going to be giving money and material to the Russians, the British, what's left of the French. The French are going to go down because the Germans are going to invade France. And so that's what the Lend-Lease program is. And again, at the end of 1941, Japan bombs the United States. And you can see we declare war against Japan on December 8th, the day after we get bombed in Pearl Harbor. A few days later, of course, we declare war on Germany and Italy because they declared war on us. And then I don't know why it took several months, but a few months later, basically the rest of Germany's allies were going to declare war on them. So now we're officially at war, all right? So you're going to watch a video about the Pearl Harbor attack, so I won't say too much, except that that attack was designed to remove the United States from interfering in Japan's plans with Asia and the Pacific. You know, Britain's super heavily involved in a war in Europe, so is France. And again, by 1941, France is all but gone. And so the only real superpower left in the Pacific is the United States. And so they do this sort of preemptive strike at Pearl Harbor, and they pull it off nearly flawlessly. And they destroy huge numbers of ships and airplanes. They killed a lot of people. And in fact, that's the largest attack on American soil until the 9/11 attacks on September 11th, 2001. And it was great. And the thinking was that that would knock us out of commission long enough for Japan to kind of do the things they needed to do. And then by the time we could kind of get back to it, we would be unable to affect any change, and there would be this new normal. Japan would control basically all of Far East Asia and so on. But that's not what happened. They knew we were going to get angry. I mean, it wasn't like that shocked them. They knew we were going to get angry. They just didn't feel like we could do anything about it. Japan's 10,000 miles away or so, and they bombed our capacity to handle that. It wasn't perfect, but it was near perfect. And of course, what happens is Americans go, well, we're in the war, and not only are we in the war, we're going to win this war, whatever it costs, whatever it takes. What the Japanese and what no one could have predicted was our ability to turn everything on, to flip a switch on the economy. Now remember, we had been basically without work for 10 years. Huge numbers of unemployment, right? 30% unemployment. Or 25% unemployment, just millions and millions and millions of people relative to the whole population unemployed, no money. Those that were employed weren't making very much money. Factories are shut down, doing nothing, and they're there, but they're not operating. And so when we joined the war, it's almost like we just went dink, flipped a switch, we turned the economy back on, everybody went back to work. Instead of making automobiles, we're going to make tanks. I have a chart here on aircraft production. I mean, even in the beginning of the war, we were making more planes than most of the other people. But look at the orange. That's the United States, the number of planes we were producing as the war progressed. It just grew and grew and grew and grew and far surpassed all of the other guys put together, right? The very forefront is Italy, the dark blue, the very small ones. And then you got Japan, and then you got Germany in the green, Britain in purple, and the Soviet Union in the light blue, and of course the United States in the orange. No one could have predicted that we would have been immediately able to turn things around. So everyone got angry, but then everyone went to work or joined the military, all right? And so we're going to just produce massive amounts of war equipment And no one could have predicted that. And so within about a year, we're actually pushing back against Japan, where they figured it would take 5 or 6. And again, there would be a new normal. So that's why they did it. They didn't not think we wouldn't get angry. They just didn't think we'd be able to do anything about it. But we did. And that's what no one could have predicted. Because remember, our economy was all but dead at that point, right? So Pearl Harbor happens. The U.S. joins World War II. Now, we need to take a second to just kind of address a huge issue, and that is America's racial problems. We have huge racial issues. America is segregated. It has been, especially since 1896, but really going back before that. And none of that's changed. You could argue things have gotten worse on the racial front in the last several decades of the 20th century. The military is segregated. They'll highlight some of this in the documentary you watch. And so that presents some huge challenges. Also, during this war, 112,000 Japanese Americans, almost all of them were Japanese Americans. Most of them were second or third generation Japanese Americans who lived along the West Coast, were moved into internment camps because they were considered security risks. There's really no evidence to suggest that they were actually security risks. This was a fear-driven racist move, and we incarcerated over 100,000 Americans for fear that they would join in some attack that the Japanese never really made. Unlike in World War I, we're talking about Germans or Italians, where in that war, people had a pretty close association with home, Germans and Italians. Germans were changing their names. People weren't eating sauerkraut. People weren't drinking beer, if you can believe that, in World War I. World War II, it's not going to happen because it's Hitler. And most Americans of German descent do not have any connection to Hitler, and most other Americans recognize that they don't. And the same holds for Italians. And so you're not going to see nearly as much of that kind of anti-German or anti-Italian sentiment that you did see in World War I. Yet, on the other side of this, over 15 million Americans are going to put on the uniform and are going to go to war or serve in some capacity. And this includes men and women from every ethnicity available in this country, including Japanese people, which seems strange when many of them are being incarcerated. But you'll have some of the famous groups, and again, I can't talk about them all, but the Tuskegee Airmen, for example, these black fighter pilots that are going to be super successful in the war at a time where people thought these guys, they don't have the capacity, right, to learn to fly an airplane, and yet they are as good as anyone else. You had the Navajo Code Talkers. This is what the picture is on the screen. These are Native Americans, of course, Navajo, but some other groups would come off the reservation, and this case, they actually use their languages to create codes and to talk on the radio, and the Japanese could never figure it out. It was brilliant. We used it again in Korea, this kind of thing. But what this is going to draw a number of Native Americans off the reservation. They are now considered citizens of the United States, but remember, they've been essentially bound into their reservations both by discrimination, by racism, and by their own choice. I mean, it works both ways. But this is going to bring tens of thousands of Native people off the reservation. They're going to go to war. They're going to succeed like everyone else does. And they're going to move forward with that. People from every walk of life join, the rich, the poor, again, everything from black to white, everyone, male and female, everyone is going to join. And those that don't join the actual military, they're going to go to work. So everyone's going to be doing something. Unemployment essentially goes down to zero, and people are going to work and work and work. My grandfather, for example, on my mother's side, worked in the Richmond shipyards in California. He was a farmer, worked on orchards and whatever he could do as a young man. Remember, they were in Arkansas. They left because of the Dust Bowl, and now the war comes, and he's working in this basically a steel plant where they're building ships and gun barrels and all this stuff. And he said everybody in there wanted to work for two reasons. One, they hadn't worked in 10 years, and two, they wanted to win. And these were older guys that didn't go to fight, so they put all their energy into production. There are far more people were killed in America in industrial accidents, for example, than were killed in the war. About 400,000 Americans were killed in the war. Way more were killed or hurt in accidents. So he said we would have worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week if we could, which of course is physically impossible. Point here is that's one of the reasons why we're able to produce so much, because everyone just went into overdrive. All right. So when the war begins, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor, and Roosevelt has to now join the effort and everything. We put our heads together with the British and now the Russians and what's left of the French. The plan that they come up with is called Europe First. Essentially, Roosevelt said, we can handle Japan for now. They're far enough away, but we got to handle the situation in Europe, where Germany is basically controlling much of Europe. Germany had invaded France. France fell in 6 weeks. Germany used these tactics called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. It's essentially using tanks as cavalry units, and they charge in real fast and they disrupt everything, while the French were still thinking in World War I terms of infantry and slow tanks. The Germans had completely retooled the whole process of tank warfare, and others were doing it too. We'll do it, the British do it, but the French didn't. And so Germany just rolled into France. Remember, they've had 20 years to figure out how to defeat France. They couldn't do it the first time, but they are going to do it the second time. So 6 weeks, France is gone. So at the same time, they're also going to invade Russia. And remember, they had invaded Poland together and signed neutrality acts, but eventually Hitler's going to decide to invade Russia. Why? Because Russia has a lot of resources that Germany wants, that needs to continue the war effort, because even though they work together with Poland, Hitler still hates the communists. He thinks everybody hates the communists, and he's not totally wrong. But what ends up happening by invading Russia and making Russia an enemy of Germany, he makes Russia now an ally of everyone else who is also an enemy of Germany. So you have the situation where the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so Russia then becomes an ally to the United States, the British, and the French. And we get what's called the Big Three, which is Russia, America, and Britain, right? You get Joseph Stalin, Russian leader. You get Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister. And you get, of course, Roosevelt, the American president. Those are the Big Three. The French leader, the non-communist Chinese leader is also part of that group too. But those three are the ones who are doing the heavy lifting and making most of the decisions. So Russia's an ally. And so for the whole war, this happens like in 1940, 1941, for the whole war, Russia's going to be asked to continue fighting Germany on their Eastern Front. Remember what happened in World War I? They had a communist revolution. They closed up shop on the war, and Germany was able to take all those soldiers in Russia and move them to France. And that's when it became super critical that the U.S. joined, because France was going to go down. Well, we know that, and so this time around, we want to make sure Russia stays in the war. And so a lot of political decisions are made in order to keep Russia in the war, one of which is Russia's going to get control of half of Europe when this is over. And later on, we'll come to regret that decision. But in the moment, it was a decision of practicality or pragmatism to keep Russia fighting, to keep Germany divided between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So that's a huge key. So that's why they're on here. But Europe First means we're going to do basically 4 things. First, we're going to bomb Germany by day. They'll talk a lot about that in the film, so I won't say much, except that it's highly dangerous to bomb by day. We're going to use technology, as they'll discuss in the film, the special bomb computer, but we're going to lose something like 1/3 of our bomb crews. But that's how committed we are. More and more people are going to keep volunteering to fly those bombing runs, knowing that a lot of these guys die. But we're bombing Germany by day. And what that means is we're bombing not armies. I'm not saying we never bomb armies, we do, but we're bombing cities, we're bombing factories, we're bombing bridges, we're bombing rail yards, we're bombing means of production and transportation and food stores, things like that. And the sad reality of that is that means we're going to bomb and kill a lot of civilians. This is how this war is fought. I say all the time, wars are fought at the limits of the technology. Well, the technology in World War II is far different than in World War I. We're not going to be landlocked and fighting from trenches this time. This war is going to be one of movement and lots of massive amounts of bombing. The casualty death rate in World War II was way, way, way higher than in World War I. And sadly, this is the nature of this war. Everyone who is fighting this war is fighting it this way. And so you're trying to prevent the enemy from fielding an army, not just defeating their army. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to start building tons of bombers. Remember our graph on how many planes we were making? That graph basically holds true for tanks and guns and everything else. All right, so that's the first part. We're going to fly to Britain. We're going to bomb Germany every day, over and over and over. The second phase is we're going to invade Africa, which sounds kind of weird. Why would we do that? Well, part of that's to help France. Part of that's to help Britain, relieve some of the pressure, keep the Germans and the Italians out of Egypt, keep the trade routes from Britain to, say, India and so on open. Those are really important to keeping the British going and helping the French. This is where General George Patton, the American general, will come into contact with a German general, General Rommel, and those two will go at it. British General Montgomery. These are really famous generals from this war, and they will duke it out. Ultimately, the British and the American forces will win, largely because the Germans just sort of run out of gas. And a lot of the reason that happens is because the British have translated or figured out or broken the German Enigma machine, which is a code machine. There's a pretty good film about it called Imitation Game with Benedict Cumberbatch that kind of goes into, again, as only a movie can, right? With extra drama and so forth. But they really did figure that out, and we're able to sort of learn what the Germans and the Italians were doing and thinking, and we could plan accordingly, and basically we starved them out in Africa. Then the third thing is they're going to invade Italy. So we invade Africa, we then jump over and invade Italy. Again, Patton and Montgomery are involved in that. Italy, very quickly after that time, surrenders. They were under the leadership of a man named Benito Mussolini, who was a fascist. In fact, he was the fascist before Hitler was. Hitler kind of followed in Mussolini's footsteps, but then he overtook Mussolini. Anyway, the people in Italy had enough of this war. They killed Mussolini in the streets. The new government surrenders. So now Italy becomes basically a property of the Allies now. And so basically, you'll notice we're going around Germany. We're not directly invading Germany. We're going around Germany. We're trying to keep Germany spread out. That's kind of the name of this game. Well, the fourth and final piece happens in June 6, 1944, which everyone knows as D-Day, but it's Operation Overlord. We're actually going to invade France. But notice, it's June 6, 1944. It's basically 3.5 years after Pearl Harbor. It takes us that long to get to a point where we can invade France. And there's a whole lot going on there. There's misdirection. There's using spies. There's double agents. We're going to create fake armies and fake airplanes like plywood and inflatable trucks to try to fool the Germans and try to get them thinking we're going to land somewhere else. And it worked. They're going to recall General Patton because General Patton gets in trouble for slapping some of his soldiers around. And so General Eisenhower, who's the American general in charge of all this, calls him back and yells at him. But they use that. They put Patton in charge of the fake army. So the Germans are all afraid of where he's going to land. And anyway, we landed on all these beaches around Normandy, France. And I would just highly encourage you to watch Saving Private Ryan, and you will get a almost first-hand experience of, as much as you can, I think, without actually being there, of what that was like. It was hell on earth. There were huge numbers of casualties. We knew there were going to be huge numbers of casualties. You can see a kind of picture of it after the fact. We've now landed a whole bunch of craft and supply craft and whatever. It was brutal. And they'll talk a little bit about it in the documentary too. And less than a year later, Germany surrenders. Or it's not our purpose to go into the ins and outs of this war. If you want to know what that was, I would encourage you to watch Band of Brothers, an HBO miniseries that was done several years ago that follows a group of guys as they work their way through Europe. This was a war of tanks and trucks and movement, and we invaded France. We then helped liberate Paris. We kind of let the French do it, even though we did all the heavy lifting. And then we're going to go from there. We're going to head north and we're going to go into Germany. In the meantime, the Russians are going to come into Germany from their side, and we're going to meet in the middle, and Hitler will kill himself, and the Germans will then surrender. The German officers that reported to Hitler told him, as soon as that Operation Overlord landing was complete and successful, they told Hitler, this war's over, we're done, we need to surrender now. Hitler said no. And of course, ends up killing himself. So we call this VE Day, or Victory Europe Day, which was May 8th, 1945. Germany unconditionally surrenders. Unfortunately, Roosevelt died about a month earlier on April 12th, 1945, which of course brings in a new president. We'll talk about him in a bit. So at that point, though, we knew the war in Europe was over. It was just a matter of time. We were closing in, and we just basically squished into Germany, invaded Germany. Remember, in World War I, we didn't invade Germany. They surrendered. The war ended. It was kind of a 5-year stalemate. This time, we're not going to take that. We will require unconditional surrender by all of the enemies this time, and we will get it. And so this war will end very, very differently than the First World War. And of course, as they are moving into Germany, they begin, the Allies, both the Russians, Americans, British, and French troops, begin uncovering these concentration camps. And Hitler, of course, was a huge racist, as many people were. Not to excuse that, but many people were. He is just super extreme. He was trying to exterminate people he considered to be undesirable. They were Jews, huge numbers of Jews, but gypsies, other people, various people that they considered to be undesirable. His task, one of them, was to murder them eventually. And they did all sorts of stuff and experiments and crazy things. The German allies didn't necessarily all know that this was going on, but they would send Jews to these so-called work camps in and around Germany. Not sure how much they were all aware of what was going on. But in the end, these poor people are going to be starved. They're going to be exposed to diseases. They're going to be gassed to death. And eventually they'll be shot, many of them. But there will be many who survive. And as the Allied armies start coming into Germany, we'll start uncovering these places. And then as we're helping the survivors, Eisenhower tells them to document everything. And they did. Believe it or not, there are people out there who think that this is a hoax, that this was perpetrated by the Allies to make the Germans look bad. And almost 11 million people were killed. About 6 million of them were Jews. The rest were these gypsies and other people who were killed as a result of these concentration camps. There are still people who have the tattoos on their arms. They were given a number. There are still some people who survived, still alive today. Not many. They're very, very old. But that is, in a very short nutshell, the war in Europe. Again, it is a war, an army war of tanks and airplanes and movement, and it's very rapid in the sense that it was 11 months when we landed in France to when the war ended. On the other side of things, we have the war in the Pacific, which I'm just going to give you a map here just to kind of show you what it is. I would encourage you to watch the miniseries called The Pacific if you want to get an idea of what this was like. You can see all these blue arrows and all these little, they look like little explosions. That's some of the bigger battles that happened. Some were at sea, some were on these little islands. This is referred to as island hopping, okay? We had to go from one island to the next to limit the area that Japan could operate in. You can see the kind of big purple region is the extent that Japan could effectively operate in. Of course, yes, they bombed us in Pearl Harbor. Yes, they attacked Midway in 1942. That was a good movie, too, that just came out in 2019, if you get a chance to watch that, about the Midway attack and what we did with that. That was the turning point. We fended off that attack, and then we began moving forward and pushing forward back against the Japanese. Again, that's what they couldn't account for, that we would be able to do that. So consider, we're fighting one entire war in Europe, and at the same time, we're fighting another entire war in the Pacific. All right? And on a small scale, that D-Day landing is going to happen all the time in the Pacific. Every single little island, the Marines are going to have to storm the beach. The Marines are going to have to dig out all the Japanese troops, and we're going to have to take that little tiny nothing island, and then we're going to have to move on to the next one. Sometimes these guys are going week after week after week, just beach invasion after beach invasion after beach invasion. It's pretty horrific. But eventually, we will push the Japanese back toward Japan. And the whole idea is to get close enough to Japan. And you can see the Philippines. We had to recover the Philippines. The Japanese took it from us early on. We have to get it back, right? You can see that doesn't happen until late, 1944, 1945, Okinawa, 1945. We're getting close enough to where we can start bombing Japan like we were bombing Germany. This is not about atomic bombs yet. No one even knows about that yet. This is about bombing Japan like we were bombing Germany, bombing factories, bombing, again, warehouses, bombing transportation to prevent them from putting troops or machines in the field, all right? Now, yes, we are going to drop 2 atomic bombs also, but that's a story for just a minute. So this is called island hopping. This is happening the entire time the rest of the war is happening. So we're really fighting 2 wars at the same time. It was very, very brutal. Casualties are pretty close to the same for both sides of this war. And we're not totally alone, but we're handling this part far more by ourselves than we were in Europe. We had help from the British and others, Chinese, for example, as well. Now, I mentioned that Roosevelt died in April of 1945. Remember, he was elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. He then swears in January of 1945, and he died in April of a brain aneurysm. If you've been with me long enough, you know he actually died of the Indian curse because he got elected in 1940, right? A year ending in 0. But in any case, he died of a brain aneurysm. He was president for almost 13 years. No one ever done that before. No one can do it now. And so here comes Harry Truman, brand newly minted vice president. He was first-time vice president that January, and now 3 months later, he is sworn in as president when Roosevelt died. He was a senator from Missouri, so he was involved in the war and so on. But remember, as a senator, he doesn't have the access certainly to as much as Roosevelt did, as the vice president might have, or as the Secretary of State did. So now he's president sort of suddenly, and he has to rebuild relationships with Churchill, with Stalin, with Chiang Kai-shek, with all the other leaders of this coalition of allied forces, right? Even though the war in Europe is over, or about to be over when he takes over, the war in Japan is far from over at that point, as we'll talk about. So we find then Truman at this thing called the Potsdam Conference, and a number of things come out of that. But a couple of things we need to talk about. One, when Truman becomes president, he's told about something called the Manhattan Project, which was a project started by Roosevelt and the government way back in 1939, and its purpose was to build an atomic bomb before anyone else did. Fortunately, we were the only ones to build an atomic bomb at this point in time, because word came out that the Germans were trying to do it. The Germans did build a whole bunch of cool stuff during the war. They had rockets, they had jet airplanes, and all this other stuff that nobody else had. But Roosevelt was able to look into the future a little bit and note that this was going to be important. And so nobody knows about this. So when when Truman becomes president, they say, oh, by the way, the Manhattan Project, and here's what it's doing. But this was in April, and we're not quite ready yet. And so Truman, just kind of says, okay, and he puts it off to the side. In the meantime, he's got to deal with the end of the war in Europe and so on. And so that's what they're doing in Potsdam, is they're discussing, this is the summer, this is like June and July time frame in the summer of 1945. We're bombing Japan like crazy. As you saw on our map, we're close enough to be bombing Japan all the time, but Japan refuses to surrender. And so we're at this conference and we're discussing what are we going to do with Germany and how all that's going to play out. What are we going to do with war criminals and, because of the concentration camps. But they're also talking about Japan and what needs to happen. And one of the things Truman's doing is he's trying to get the Russians to help us with Japan. Now remember, Russia staying in the war in Europe cost us half of Europe, right? We had to give half of Europe to Russia. So who knows what it's going to cost to keep Russia in the war in Asia too. And Truman doesn't want to, but he's kind of forced to. Well, it's in those meetings that he is told by his people the atomic bomb works. And so at that point, Truman then sort of cuts off negotiations with the Russians because he doesn't trust them and he doesn't want to give them anything more than he has to. And then we focus on forcing the Japanese to surrender by using the atomic bomb. Because the question we are faced with at that point, summer of 1945, was the next step was to invade Japan proper. And it's very difficult to invade an island anyway. We've already, again, been through several other invasions. And we know, for example, that Japan's not going to surrender. They refuse to surrender up to this point. All of the other countries are demanding they surrender. They say no. We are intercepting and translating all of their communications, and I've read a lot of these myself, and they are saying we are not going to surrender. We're going to fight to the last man, woman, child, and Japanese grandma. We're going to arm everybody, and we're going to make it impossible. And so the casualty estimates are between 500,000 and 1 million Americans would be spent trying to invade Japan to force them to surrender, and it would be way more millions of Japanese people. And so nobody wants to do this, but this is going to be the next step. When the atomic bomb is made available, that is a way to bypass this, to avoid all these American casualties. That's what Truman was concerned about, as he should have been. And if we could force them to surrender, then it removes the problem of Russian interference here. So they do decide to bomb Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. So the Enola Gay, again, they'll go into this in some of your documentary video, will drop this bomb. It will have a devastating effect. Something like 80,000 people are killed almost instantly. And of course, then the whole, whatever's left of the city catches on fire, and there'll be many more deaths because of radiation. You need to keep in mind, nobody really understood what they were doing. They just knew that this thing was going to be huge, and it was huge. They didn't know it was going to work. It's one thing to test this bomb in a lab-type condition in a desert in New Mexico where you can control everything. It's another to drop it out of the belly of an airplane and hope that it goes off. There's lots of commentary about why we did it. It's racist. We wouldn't have done it to the Germans. We absolutely would have. We should have warned the Japanese. Then what's the point? What if it didn't work? There's all these reasons. The point is they dropped it. It worked. Japan refused to surrender. So 3 days later, we dropped another one on Nagasaki. It has the same result. And at that point, the Emperor of Japan, and the picture I have on here actually kind of cuts him out. I need to fix that. But the Emperor's the guy, you see the cane just barely in the frame, his hand. But anyway, Japan has an emperor, sort of like Britain has a queen. They don't actually run the government. In Japan, it's a religious kind of figurehead. But at this moment, the emperor just kind of steps up and says, no, we're done. We're surrendering. He does a very kingly thing because we had more bombs to drop and we would have kept dropping them until they surrendered. So this was a good thing. So he surrenders. The process takes a little while. Officially, Victory Japan Day, or VJ Day, is September 2nd, 1945. You could go back to mid-August when they actually surrendered. They're on board the USS Missouri. General MacArthur is going to take their surrender. So, the bomb avoided a huge number of casualties, as horrific as it was. And, of course, it'll get more horrific as time passes. And Truman's popularity will suffer for it, but in the end, I'm not sure what other real decision they had. They could have not accepted unconditional surrender, and that's an argument people have made. But the problem with that is that's what happened in World War I with people, and no one wants to do that again. So we're going to take total surrender or nothing. And that, again, if you were living in 1940s America, you would have probably felt the same way. So that's it. That's the lecture on the war. I thought it would take a whole lot longer. But the next lecture we're going to come back to is called Superpower. We're going to talk about the aftermath of the war, and then we're going to start getting into the 1950s. So we'll talk Korea and things like that. We'll look at the Cold War and some of the next couple lectures. So be ready for that. and you will see me next time.